Hello, fellow Biosphereans. Welcome to Biosphere 1, known tonight as the Loft Cinema, which is currently located in outer space, apparently. But actually, the Loft Cinema is located on Biosphere 1, Earth, Tucson, Arizona. My name is Jeff. I'm the program director here at the Loft Cinema on Biosphere 1. And I want to thank you for joining us tonight for this talk-back discussion about this really great new documentary that I hope you had a chance to watch, Spaceship Earth. So if you watched Spaceship Earth online, if you streamed it in the last few days and you did that through the Loft Cinema, I wanted to thank you because half of the proceeds from your ticket to watching Spaceship Earth benefits the Loft Cinema, which is a very important revenue stream for us right now while we're closed due to the pandemic. So any of our streaming films that you watch will benefit us to some degree. So we really appreciate that. We're happy we could still bring you new films, even though we're not physically open. I also want to thank our great partners at Neon Releasing. Neon is the distributor of Spaceship Earth. They are also the folks who brought us Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, which was one of my favorite movies last year and was a gigantic success everywhere, both at art house cinemas and at the Academy Awards, as we know. So thank you, Neon, for making this film available to us here at the Loft and other art houses around the country. I just wanted to say, like, a little personal note on Spaceship Earth. I saw this film at Sundance this year. I saw the premiere at Sundance back in January, and I have to admit, a little bit thrilled to see that someone had finally made a movie about Biosphere 2, because I've long been fascinated with Biosphere 2, both its aesthetic, its mission, its origins, the Biospherians, everything. And no one has made a film yet about this until now. I'm not sure why, but I think it's finally time. And I think it's a very effective film. And I know that when I was a lad, my family and I went to the Biosphere 2 while the original Biospherians were in the sphere to look at them, which was a strange experience. It was like going to the zoo, but looking at human beings. I was fascinated because I was a science fiction nut as a kid, and this was like science fiction without the fiction, the geodesic domes, and the fact that people were inside of basically this bubble being watched by other people outside was just fascinating to me. And I didn't necessarily know a lot about the origins of Biosphere 2 until years later when I actually kind of looked into it. But I think the film does a really good job of capturing the evolution of the Biosphere 2 and what its intentions were, what eventually happened to it. This is really a story that a screenwriter could not write because it's just fascinating. So I'm curious if anyone involved tonight in this chat went to the Biosphere 2 when the original 8 Biospherians were in the Biosphere. That was 91 to 93. And if so, what were your impressions of the whole experience? I think if you grew up here in Tucson or you moved here later in life, I happen to have been here most all of my life, the Biosphere 2 is just sort of part of your history, and I think it's a great Tucson original. It's a great part of what makes Tucson so fascinating. Yes, it's located in Oracle, but I'm going to use Tucson in general. It is a Tucson original, sort of like the Linda Ronstadt of Unique Environmental Science Research Facilities located in the desert. I love Linda Ronstadt too. Another Tucson original. So this film was directed by Matt Wolf. And some of you may be familiar with another very interesting documentary he made in 2019 called Recorder: The Marion Stokes Project, which was this really fascinating documentary about a woman named Marion Stokes, who for 30 years constantly recorded television news programs, and she amassed 70,000 VHS tapes, 6-hour tapes, full of news from 30 years. And it was just a really interesting kind of look at how people interact with technology and politics, and also obsessive folks, which some may say that was also something that fueled the Biosphere 2 project, obsession, which is also why it's interesting. So Matt Wolf, again, I think is a pretty great filmmaker at looking at interesting moments in our history and the people that were behind those moments and what drove them to do what they did. Oh, there's Christian. Hi, Christian Ramirez. She says, we took a field trip there when I was in elementary school. We could see them in there, but were unable to enter. Yes, because entering would have destroyed the integrity of the project. Although, as we saw in the film, that was part of the problem ultimately when one of the Biospherian leaves and then comes back. She did catch her hand in a thresher and had to go to the hospital. But of course, she came back in with 1 or 2 duffel bags, mysteriously. There's been a lot of talk over the years about what was actually in those duffel bags and how that maybe corrupted the integrity of the project, that she left and came back, and what did she bring back? Probably computer parts, they say. Some speculate food. We don't know for sure. So I thought maybe we'd just talk a little bit about the origins of Biosphere 2, because I think the movie really shines a light on maybe what not everyone knew about where Biosphere 2 started, that it started basically on what looks like a hippie compound in New Mexico in the 1960s. And that's why this film is so interesting to me, because it kind of looks at the way the origins of Biosphere 2 are really rooted in the counterculture, that moment in the 1960s when people were working together communally. There was a lot of idealism. There was a lot of hope for the future and an activist spirit that was also infused with art. I think someone in the film says life is theater. And one of the criticisms, of course, of the Biosphere 2 project is that the participants were part of this theatrical commune troupe in New Mexico, and they performed theatrical productions both in the Biosphere and prior to that. But I think you have to contextualize it. That's what was going on in the 60s, and that was probably not that unusual. But they were also a corporation. As they point out, they were not actually, they were actually a business, maybe not a corporation. They actually sought investments for projects. They tried to make money because they were funding this holistic project they had that involved theater, art, environmentalism, activism. And again, I think that's one of the reasons the Biosphere project has had sort of a tainted history because of those origins. But again, it was the 60s, man. And I'm also very fascinated by John Allen. So I'm curious what your thoughts about John Allen are. So John Allen, of course, in case you don't remember, is of course the leader of the Synergists, which was the name of the group, business organization, hippie organization. And he is, again, a character that no one could write. It's just too good. An engineer, an ecologist, an impresario, some would say cult leader. That term got thrown around a lot when describing John Allen. And in the film, I think he comes off quite well, articulate, passionate, inspired. I think his intentions were great. But you can see something about his demeanor that would make you think possibly cult leader. He's described in the film as genius and charismatic, but also tempestuous. And I think the origins of John Allen are a deep dive topic that the director just did a drive-by on. He didn't really go into that deeply enough, I think, and I'm curious what all of you think about that, about the origins of John Allen. Because I think there might be a bigger story. There was the marrying of the younger women, or the younger woman who became the chief financial officer of the Biosphere 2 project. But it is. So he's a great character. Ed Bass, of course, is another great character in the film and in the real story. The Texas billionaire, I believe, part of the fourth richest family in America. And clearly, I think he doesn't get interviewed in the film, but I think he comes off as someone who's using his resources for good. Clearly, he has interest in ecology and environmentalism and in philanthropy, but he also wants to make money. And I think that's what's interesting about that character, is that clearly he wanted to profit off of the Biosphere 2 beyond the research capabilities, but profit off it by licensing out more Biosphere 2s to be built on other planets when we started colonizing. And that tension between those two characters, I think, is really interesting, because the media really created characters for these two people. Of course, John Allen was the kind of crazed cult leader, and Ed Bass was sort of like a James Bond villain who was trying to create his own Eden in the desert, and maybe he was going to then profit off of these biospheres in outer space. But I think that's sort of the easy characterization of these two very complex people. I'm also curious if anyone knows any of the Biospherians. Of course, one of the Biospherians in the film, one of the great characters, one of the great real people, was Linda Lee, who was the botanist on the project. She currently still lives in Oracle, near the Biosphere 2. And she recently opened the Oracle Community Learning Garden, so she's still involved in earth sciences and environmentalism. She's also working on like food supply projects for people without food. And so if anyone, or perhaps if Linda Lee is on this chat, I'll bet she's not, but if she is, we would love to hear from you. Just a lot of great characters in the film. And one thing that I wondered about always from when I first was at the Biosphere in the 90s was about the interpersonal dynamics of the people in the Biosphere. And what do we think about that in terms of the way the film presents the interpersonal dynamics? It was always my assumption that there was probably a lot of internal strife because these people were living together for 2 years, 8 people, basically in quarantine, as we all are right now, and we know how hard that's been for us. So can you imagine 2 years of that with 8 people? And so the Biosphere 2 project always struck me as almost as much of a psychological experiment as it was an environmental experiment. And an interesting fact that I learned reading a book about the Biosphere 2 is that the Biosphere 2 was actually the inspiration for the TV show Big Brother, the original version of Big Brother, which originated in the Netherlands in the late 90s. And the producers of that show said the Biosphere 2 project was really their inspiration for putting a group of disparate people together in one location and locking them in and seeing what happened. So I don't know that the film really, I think the film was avoiding, I think Matt Wolf, the director, was trying to avoid sensationalism and not talking too much about the interpersonal conflicts. We know there was one couple going into the Biosphere. There's mention that there were factions between the Biospherians when they left the Biosphere. They didn't speak to 4 of them didn't speak to the other 4, but we don't know exactly why. So I wanted more. I wanted more. I want to know everything, basically. I want to know everything that was going on. But that does get away from the idea of the Biosphere 2 as this incredible scientific research project. But I think it's all relevant, actually. So do we think that the biospherians' relationships with one another actually affected the project itself? I think you can't discount the human factor in something like this. And as they say in the film, this was an experiment, and the Biosphere 2 project received a lot of criticism at the time because it failed. But it was an experiment, and an experiment, you don't know how it's going to turn out. They say in the film that they were trying to figure it out. They expected there to be problems, perhaps not as many problems as there turned out to be, but the whole process of an experiment is learning what works and what doesn't. Important to keep in mind, I think, that the project was intended as a 100-year project, that there were going to be different groups of biospherians going in isolation for 100 years. And that clearly did not pan out. But they were taking the long-term goal here. And for those of you who, I'm curious if anyone knows a lot about the second Biosphere 2 experiment, which was in 1994. So there were two groups of biospherians who went into the Biosphere 2 in lockdown. The original group that we saw here in the film from 91 to 93, and then for several months in 1994, there was a second group that goes in. And there's no mention of that in the film Spaceship Earth. So I think that was an interesting omission on the director's part. But if you've read anything about that second experiment, it ended before, it was a 10-month project. That ended before 10 months. It was maybe, I think, 6 or 7 months. And it was happening right during the transition when the Decisions Investment Corporation took over the Biosphere 2. And some of the original biospherians apparently went to the Biosphere 2 to warn the new biospherians about what was happening with the management takeover, because they didn't think they knew. Supposedly they broke into the Biosphere 2 to warn them. As legend has it, I haven't confirmed this, although I read it in a book, that perhaps some of the original biospherians broke some of the windows of the Biosphere 2 to contaminate the project, so it would have to end letting oxygen into the dome. So it was kind of a mess. The second experiment was kind of a mess. And again, I think it's interesting that it is not discussed in the film. But it was at that very pivotal moment when one of the other very interesting characters in the film pops up. So when Steve Bannon unexpectedly pops up into this film towards the end, it's like when the shark in Jaws just pops out of the water for the first time. Like, ugh. If you're not expecting it, and if you didn't know that Steve Bannon was the acting CEO of the Biosphere 2 in 94, it's a shock. It's a shocker. And that was the moment when, there was angst on the part of the original biospherians that they felt this is when Biosphere 2 was becoming more about making money than about scientific research. And that's when the original management, including John Allen, was ousted from the Biosphere 2. It was a corporate takeover, basically. But I wonder if anyone else found it interesting to hear Steve Bannon in the archival footage talking about climate change and how the Biosphere 2 was a great research project to try and combat climate change, global warming. Felt a little ironic. I saw the filmmaker speak about the Steve Bannon aspect of the film, and some people were asking him at the screening at Sundance, why didn't you interview Steve Bannon for the film? And he said, well, he didn't really feel the need to give Steve Bannon the microphone to talk more about anything. But I think it would have been interesting to hear him talk about the project, given how he came off talking about climate change back in '94, as opposed to what's happening today. So that's another great character. I'm also curious what we all feel about the tone of Spaceship Earth. For me, it's not totally clear how the filmmaker feels about the project. I mean, clearly, you can tell that he's very inspired by sort of the optimistic drive of the synergists to creating this project and raising the $200 million from Ed Bass to build this like really amazing facility in the desert. And kind of their sense of adventure and idealism and ambition. It's not always clear to me how he feels about the project as a whole, whether it was a success or a failure. But I think that's why the movie is a good documentary, because he doesn't necessarily insert his own opinions about the subject matter. But I think he's also looking at the larger picture, which I found interesting, is that really the story of the biosphere too, in part, is about big business versus activism and idealism, and how those two forces make strange bedfellows, and it's perhaps don't work together, because that's of course what kind of ended the run of the original Biospherians, is the corporate takeover of the facility. But this whole idea of a hippie utopia sort of working together to create something positive, I think, is very inspiring, and I think you can look at this film as either a cautionary tale or as an inspirational tale. And I would personally look at it as both, falling somewhere in between. And I'm curious what anyone else thinks about that. It's a cautionary tale because, of course, there were mistakes made, big mistakes. But again, there was idealism and optimism and the spirit of experimentation involved. Things were going to go wrong. And that's the inspiring part of the tale for sure. But I think perhaps one of the aspects of the story that has made it so continually interesting, that also sort of destroyed the original project to a great degree, was the media. So that the kind of media sensationalism over the Biosphere 2, I think, really shaped the public perception of what happened in that experiment. And by the way, if you're from Tucson, how great was it to get to see some of our former TV news journalists in the film, like Patty Weiss and Tina Naughton, to name just a couple. But the media really latched onto this. And I love how in the film, some of the Biospherians say that they had no press experience. They didn't send out a press release when they opened the Biosphere 2, when they were planning the Biosphere 2. Then they ended up later having to hire an official PR firm. So they seemed a little naive about that this was going to become such a big deal to the world at large. And this became a viral sensation before the internet was a thing. It was a big, big deal. And I think the media coverage of the Biosphere 2, and if you were around during that time when that was happening, between 91 and 93, you probably remember, and you see some of that in the film, about how the press coverage started out very optimistic and not really skeptical, saying, "Oh, this is a great moment for science. We've never seen anything like this. This is a harbinger of things to come." And then as the 2 years went along and more things started going wrong, with the CO2 scrubbers, when it was revealed that there were CO2 scrubbers in the Biosphere that were not revealed to the public, when they brought in fresh oxygen for the Biospherians, when things started dying and the cockroaches started taking over, the press really turned. And that's when it that's when these kind of storyline, the narrative of John Allen being a cult leader, I think, kind of started, and how this was a disaster, and the charges of public deception and fraud because they didn't tell the public what was really happening in terms of, like, bringing in the oxygen and the CO2 scrubbers. It all seemed to hinge on the extra oxygen and those CO2 scrubbers. But I think it's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate because the press, I think, really was able to sort of turn the public's perception of what the origins were of this and what the great potential of this was into something that was kind of a good, crazy, wacky story, which it was that too. But there were a lot of successes that came out of the biosphere too. Of course, the savanna survived. The coral reefs did well. The rainforest endured past this. A lot of things went wrong, but a lot of things went right. And I think given the fact that they knew going in there were going to be problems, that was pretty impressive. So I think this is not really a surprise that this is what the media can do to a story, is to sort of change the narrative. But I think it's really pronounced in this case. And I also love seeing Rue McClanahan, one of the Golden Girls in the film, doing I think she was doing a PSA for the Biosphere 2, which was kind of interesting, and I've never seen that. I'm a big Golden Girls fan, and I've never seen that. So this, I think also something that really struck me watching this film is just the intense relevance to today. Clearly, when they were building the Biosphere 2, they knew that there was problems with the environment, which are, of course, even more pronounced today. But I feel like, really, if this project were happening today, I think it would probably be treated with more serious interest and serious respect, because, of course, the problem is so much more pronounced today, even than it was in '91. At least our perception of it has become more pronounced. So in a way, these biospherians were, I think, ahead of the curve a bit. So they were actually sort of explorers and looking ahead, which I think is very inspiring. And of course, this particular moment that we're living in, the quarantine era we're all living in, I think puts a very interesting spin on watching this movie about people who are locked in to a space and forced to sort of work within their own personal living environments. So that timing was obviously coincidental and not planned, but the fact that Neon Distribution released this film now via virtual cinemas and on the internet, so that we have to watch it at home, I think really makes this almost feels more like an interactive experience than if you had watched this in a movie theater, I think, because once you stop watching Spaceship Earth, you can't necessarily leave the theater. You're there. You're not stuck there for 2 years, but you are stuck there for a while. So I think the moment, timing is everything, and I think the moment that this film was released was actually spot on. This is kind of like the official quarantine film, I think, right now, because that's what it's all about. So that was very interesting, I think. I'm curious what all of you think about the project. Ultimately, was this a success or was this a failure? And I sort of threw in my 2 cents. I think it's a little bit of both. And I think also just along those lines, it's important to point out there is a credit at the end of the film, which indicates that the University of Arizona is now the owner and the operator of the Biosphere 2, which is great, because it shows that the project, I think, was a success, because it's continuing to be a success, and they're doing lots of great climate change research at the Biosphere 2 now as we speak, under the ownership of the University of Arizona. It was operated for quite a few years in the late 90s, early 2000s by Columbia University. But now the university, thanks to a very large donation from Ed Bass, who is still giving them money, which is great today, to continue the research. So however eccentric Ed Bass might seem, or whatever questions you might have about his motives, clearly he's interested in supporting this project and what they're doing, and in climate change, and in trying to find solutions, and probably in trying to make money as well. That's fine. So again, I think that's just important to remember, that the biosphere did and does continue. The Biosphere 2 does continue beyond what we see in the film. So it doesn't give you a sense that the whole thing collapsed and that's it, because it's still there. And as a matter of fact, interestingly, to connect it to the Loft Cinema, we hosted when this film was coming out in January, before we knew that we were going to be on lockdown, that there was a pandemic coming. I was talking to Neon Distribution about, oh, this is great. We're in Tucson. The Biosphere 2 is in Tucson. We want to do a screening at the Biosphere, an outdoor screening in front of the Biodome. We want to do Q&As here at the theater with some of the scientists and researchers from the University of Arizona who are currently working on projects at the Biosphere 2. So that was the plan until all of this happened. Which is very unfortunate. Some of you may have attended our 2018 outdoor screening at the Biosphere 2 of the movie The Martian, which was great, which was one of my favorite solar cinema outdoor screenings we've done on the lawn in front of the compound. It was great, and we had someone from the Biosphere 2 come and introduce the film, because some of the research that appears in the movie The Martian was actually done at the Biosphere 2, particularly the potato growing by Matt Damon on Mars. That aspect of the story of The Martian came directly from some research that was done at Biosphere 2. So that was great. And then a couple of years before that, we did a screening here at the Loft Cinema of the movie Silent Running, with several of the scientists who are currently working at the Biosphere 2. And Silent Running, of course, the 1972 film starring Bruce Dern, who basically is the caretaker of a Biosphere 2 in outer space on a spaceship. In the film Spaceship Earth, we see that Silent Running is talked about as a real inspiration for the project of Biosphere 2, and also the jumpsuits. I love how the jumpsuits were created because they would look good on television. But if you get a chance to watch Silent Running, you'll see that some of the spacesuits in the film are actually just like the red spacesuits that the Biospherians wear in the project that we see in the film, which is sort of my ode to my red shirt here. I didn't have a jumpsuit to wear tonight. I thought I did, but I didn't. So there's a lot of kind of pop culture connections to the Biosphere 2 project as well. Of course, a lot of people know about Biodome, the Pauly Shore comedy, alleged comedy from 1996. A lot of people, I think that film was shot at the Biosphere 2, but it was not. It was just inspired by the Biosphere 2 project, but it was filmed on a set. So I don't think there's any chance of Pauly Shore necessarily visiting the Biosphere 2, but who knows? Maybe. And then finally, a couple years ago, when we had the filmmaker Roger Corman here at the Loft Cinema for our film fest. Roger Corman, of course, the king of the B movies, who has created everything from Attack of the Crab Monsters to Death Race 2000. He was very interested in talking to me about the Biosphere 2, because he just thought it was fascinating, and he thought it would make a great location for a zombie apocalypse film. I don't think anything's come of that, but he seemed very keen on having humans trapped in the Biosphere 2 while zombies tried to get in and raged outside. So the Biosphere, I think, will always live on as a real sort of creative impetus for people, because it's a fascinating story. There was a novel that came out in 2014 by T.C. Boyle. I think it's called The Terranauts, which is directly based on the biosphere experiment, the original biosphere experiment that we see in the film. And this is an endlessly fascinating story. And again, I think the film did a wonderful job of telling the story. It's a 25-year story, basically, from origins to completion of the original project. And that's difficult to pull off, a film of that scope, a documentary of that scope. I think there were some avenues that could have been explored more fully that weren't, but it's hard to fault a film for what it doesn't do. So like focusing on what it does do, I think it does very well. Had I made the movie, would have made it a little differently, perhaps. But ultimately, I think what we can take away from Spaceship Earth is that it was really a story of hope and learning and experience and experimentation. And I think it's something that we can all take inspiration from today. I think it's easy to be cynical about things and easy to be cynical about how it didn't work and it failed and they didn't know what they were doing, though they did know what they were doing. But things fell apart to a certain extent. But I think the important thing is that they tried it, and they got the money themselves, they built it themselves, they were doing research. A lot of the research that they did in the Biosphere 2 project actually has been used in space exploration years later. And I think it was brought down by a few things that they didn't know that were going to be a problem, like the CO2, the greenhouse effect that was created inside of the biosphere. And I think they probably all learned a little something. They all are still alive, all the biospherians, except for one, as we see the older doctor in the film, who was going to live to be 120. He unfortunately did not do that. I think he died at the age of 79 a few years ago. But all the rest of them are still alive, and they're still working in environmentalism pursuits, and some of them are working in space research. So it did not destroy their optimism about science and saving the planet, which is nice to see, I think. So we're nearing the end of our time together here in Spaceship Earth. So if anyone has any more comments about the film that we should discuss, please chat them up there, and we can kind of talk about them a little bit. But if not, I would just say thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us for this chat. Thanks for watching the film. Again, we have lots of other films that are streaming through the Loft Cinema's virtual cinema while we're closed. The opening of the Loft is pending. We don't have dates yet, but we will be back. But for now, we're virtual, so please rent lots of movies from us. We really appreciate that. Please join our talkbacks. We'll be doing more of these with other films. And until we can see you at the theater in person, at which point I will see you at the movies, please stay safe. Please stay in your Spaceship Earth. And thank you for supporting, as always, the Loft Cinema. Good night.